Hello, I'm Nick Offerman, white male translator for Gaslit Nation. To sum up this week's episode, kleptocracy anywhere is kleptocracy everywhere, and this is a transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government. Thanks for listening.
I'm Sarah Kendzior, the author of the best-selling books The View from Flyover Country and Hiding in Plain Sight.
I'm Andrea Chalupa, a journalist and filmmaker and the writer and producer of the journalistic thriller Mr. Jones.
And this is Gaslit Nation, a podcast covering corruption in the Trump administration and rising autocracy around the world.
And on this special, we are bombarding Sarah with questions about her new book, Hiding in Plain Sight, The Invention of Donald Trump and the Erosion of America. So in the last episode, I interviewed Sarah, and in this episode, our listeners are interviewing Sarah. Normally, we do a monthly Q&A with our Patreon supporters. You can sign up there to ask us a question every month and get in on that big family table that we do. We've got a lot of weird, wonderful questions because we have a lot of weird, beautiful people that support the show, and we cannot make the show without them. So that Q&A is a lot of fun for us. We get to connect with our listeners. We get ideas. We get a good laugh. We get a nice release, and it's just, we enjoy it. So join the fun there on our Patreon. First, the big release of Sarah's book, we opened up the Q&A to everybody. So we put a call out on a recent episode saying, send us your questions, and then a call out on Twitter. And so here are all the questions we received from people from all over about Sarah's new book. And so I will start the show with the first question from David. David asks, "Morning, Andrea." Good morning, David. "Please mention the Gaslit Nation action guide and ask Sarah, if there is a single thing each of us can do to remove Trump in November, what is it?"
All right. Well, thank you, David. And for those of you who don't know, we have a Gaslit Nation action guide at gaslitnationpod.com. It gives a lot of different recommendations about, not just like removing Trump, but sustaining our democracy, preserving our rights and freedoms, and so forth. And, one of the things we emphasize on that guide is to act locally and think independently, and that everybody has a different skill or talent or ability that they can bring to this struggle. And so I encourage that. I think it doesn't do much if we're all doing the same thing. We're all living in different places. We all have different skills and different disadvantages. Find something that you're interested in, that, you want to get involved in your own community or nationally, and just go for it. But, one thing, though, that everyone should do in November is vote. And in order for that to be possible, we need to have elections with integrity, which are currently being threatened. And so I do encourage everyone right now to talk to your own representatives about election integrity, about voting by mail, which is likely to be necessary because of the coronavirus crisis. And on that note, about the GOP's attempt to shut down the Postal Service, because if we can't have an election, if we can't have a fair and free election, then obviously we are going to be stuck with this transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government for an even longer period of time. So that is something that everybody can do.
Great answer. Okay. So the next question is from Chris Sandra asks, so I'm deep into the book, enjoying being able to listen to Sarah read her own words via the Audible app while I follow along with my physical copy. Wow, that's really studious. Sarah, your masterful prose elucidates revolting truth with poetic beauty like a spoonful of sugar that helps the medicine go down. Furthermore, your love of St. Louis and the history of the state of Missouri reminds me of how Jane Jacobs wrote about the boroughs of New York City in the 1960s and 70s. The death and life of great American cities. View from flyover country, dark age ahead, hidden in plain sight. So those are the two comparisons Chris Sonder makes. As someone who foolishly believed that my longtime plan to embark on a decade of international nomadism would conveniently allow me to avoid the worst of what is headed our way, I'm especially interested in your reasons for remaining in Missouri. Is there anywhere you would move to if barriers, like affordability, weren't big issues? Or do you still believe in the possibilities and likely necessity of community building wherever you find yourself?
Right. Well, thank you, Cassandra. That was very kind of you to say, especially the Jane Jacobs comparison. I definitely don't think embarking on a decade of international nomadism was foolish. My God, like to be able to travel again now with coronavirus, I fantasize about it all the time. And we all know life is short, so take advantage of any opportunity you can to expand your mind, see the world, learn new things. There's no shame in that. About Missouri, no, I wouldn't move. I wouldn't leave St. Louis. Of course, there's a barrier of affordability. I'm married, we're raising children here. We don't make that much money. We're trying to stay afloat. And of course, there's a lot of uncertainty with coronavirus. No one's really moving anywhere. But I like living in St. Louis. I think it's a genuinely interesting place. I don't want to generalize about like the culture of St. Louis. Obviously, the political culture of St. Louis and Missouri is quite corrupt, as you see in my book. But people here, are more blunt, less pretentious. I've met so many interesting people. The most interesting people I've met in my life live in St. Louis. It's a city full of free shit, which I highly enjoy. Our museums, our parks. I love the landscape of Missouri. I love going to the Ozarks. I love hiking. And I love this is all, I don't want to say I loved because I'm really hoping all these things come back and I'm able to enjoy them again at some point. But the openness of the land and the sort of like the Gothic quality of some of these places and the food and the barbecue. I mean, I don't know. There's so much that I really do love about living here that I don't want to move. I love to travel. I love to visit other parts of the US and other parts of the world. But, this is my home. And this is also where I brought up my children. My children were born in St. Louis. This is where their friends are, their community is. This is what they know. And when you have children, you see the world through their eyes. You become very grateful for the people in your community who make their lives possible, their teachers, our neighbors, and so forth. And so I feel attached to them. I feel protective of St. Louis. And yeah, there's no place like home, even during a pandemic.
Yeah, and that decision of whether to stay or leave is always a difficult one for anybody. So Jennifer asks, this question is for the hiding in plain sight portion of your podcast. Thank you for taking questions. I'm reading all these. I'm reading the compliments. I'm reading all like the everything that people are writing here. Okay, so in chapter 7, you touch on the QAnon believers and how occasionally they hit on something real. Sarah, has any of your academic research on other authoritarian states covered this act of threading truth with lies intended to spin them as conspiracy? And if so, do you know if there are paid operatives who sit around scheming how to best spin these controversies into conspiracy theories, or do they happen organically? Also, I was shocked to hear about the threats to your safety. Please remain safe. We need your voice now more than ever.
All right. Well, thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that. And yes, this is definitely something that authoritarian states do, particularly in the digital era. And I discuss this a bit in Hiding in Plain Sight when I talk about networked authoritarianism, which was a theory proposed by the social scientist Rebecca McKinnon kind of around 2010, maybe a bit before. It was basically that authoritarian states like Russia or Azerbaijan were purposefully leaving the internet partially open. They weren't censoring it entirely as was expected so that they could basically torpedo the entire notion of truth, so that they could let conspiracy theories and propaganda and false narratives and threats and mobs and all these things that are now part of basically every country's political culture, including ours, so that they could let this thrive. And yes, this is frequently a state-sponsored operation. And Peter Pomerantsev, Andrea, you probably agree with this, is somebody who has studied this from within, how Russian media has controlled these narrative arcs. And yes, there are people that sit there as spin masters. They develop conspiracy theories. They put them into orbit. And this isn't new. This predates the internet. And it's also not unique to authoritarian states. Like, this is something that America did. This is where so many racist narratives, for one thing that immediately springs to mind, come from. And we've been fed a lot of garbage, I think, like throughout our lives. Like, adulthood is often a process in the US of disentangling yourself from propaganda that you were taught in school or by the media, or just kind of learning buried truths about our history. And yeah, there's a political agenda there. Sometimes I don't think it's completely conscious. It's just people reiterating things they heard other places. Sometimes it's quite intentional and deliberate. And that's certainly the case with the Trump administration. They're very adept at this. And Trump spent his whole life, even just as an individual, inserting stories about himself into tabloids, playing himself on reality TV. As to the QAnon folks, QAnon, for example, was discussing Jeffrey Epstein long before the media discussed Jeffrey Epstein. And I have no patience for the people in QAnon who are encouraging violence, encouraging authoritarianism, none of that. But I do think that there are people who just are aware that there is an incredible level of corruption and exploitation and atrocities being committed by elites in high positions of command that no one is holding accountable. And so they get sucked down this wormhole of QAnon, which at least is willing to admit what Epstein was doing, or Dershowitz, or other people in that fold. And I think it's a shame that some people who maybe, discovered this basically a cult at this point got sucked into it, maybe with good intentions in mind. And the remedy to this is to just tell the truth. It's to tell the truth, even if it implicates powerful individuals. It's to tell the truth, even if it pisses off people on both sides of the aisle. If everybody would just come clean about these atrocities and quit trying to protect criminal elites, for reasons of access or power or whatever, we would all be in a better place. We would all maybe even be able to unite again as a country. I mean, it's so bleak to think wow, maybe we'll come together around the horrific truth of Jeffrey Epstein. But honestly, that's one of those few things that almost everybody agrees on. So I always encourage people to pursue the truth in that regard.
All right. Oh, and just to add on to that, so you mentioned Peter Pomerantsev. He has a great book that we have on our Gaslit Nation reading guide that you can check out on gaslitnationpod.com. Get our reading guide there. And the book of the author Sarah mentioned, Peter Pomerantsev, the book is called Nothing is True and Everything is Possible, The Surreal Heart of the New Russia. He talks about Russia essentially being a propaganda empire and how propaganda works, like the fever dream of it and how it's mass produced. So go check that out. Okay, so Robert asks, Sarah, your epilogue, yes, painfully, heartbreakingly, tearfully, we cannot expect to see peace in our time. And yes, instead, we expect a continued erosion of freedom, horrific shifts in our environmental climate and our national law, surveillance culture to exacerbate fear to the point of submission, no longer recognizable as such. And wearily, we expect elite criminal impunity to prosper as long as officials continue to refuse to enforce its accountability. Soberly, we expect recessions and censorship. And finally, fearfully, we understand that violence will indeed be upon us all. No, of course, we cannot accept this. In American autocracy, we refuse to accept this. We will never settle. Sarah, please talk a bit about what it will be like to settle the score.
Well, thank you, Robert. And thank you for putting up with my bleak and relentless book. We're not headed into good times, and I recognize this as somebody I'm probably, if I'm lucky, halfway through my life. I mean, God only knows what's coming down the next couple of years, but I basically am fighting for my children's future, maybe for our grandchildren's future. Maybe they will have a shot at something good. Maybe they'll have a shot at a sustainable and just world. And so at this point, one of the biggest problems I think we have is a lack of understanding about our own history and about the people who govern us. In Hiding in Plain Sight, I lay out these networks of power in which you see the same names recurring over and over again for 40 years. People like Trump, Manafort, Bill Barr. And then also, you could trace that back to their mentors, to Roy Cohn, to Henry Kissinger. There's this whole untold story about the post-World War II order. And I feel like my book is just a sliver. I left a trail that opens up a lot of avenues of exploration. And I hope that people go down them. I hope people explore them, because I think we need something akin to a truth and reconciliation commission. And we need deep, unsparing examinations of atrocities from recent American histories, the ones that have broken us, that have entrenched corruption, that have torn this country apart. We need all that to be aired in public. The financial collapse, the war in Iraq, what happened before and after 9/11, the inability to prevent that crisis. And of course, the role of organized crime in government, which is one of the major stories that the media just won't touch. So for now, what I try to do is bring forth information, convey it in a way that resonates with people. There are other people in other jobs, like our whole notion of what the law means, what the courts mean, it's up in the air because that's the only thing that this band of elite criminals cares about is their impunity. They want to hold on to their money, they want to hold on to their power, and they want to be immune from prosecution. And they have become increasingly successful in this latter venture in not actually being held accountable in the courts, not being incarcerated, even though they're extraordinarily dangerous. Like they're just out and about, running around, people like Michael Flynn and so forth. So there needs to be accountability there. That's one of the reasons I'm not optimistic about the future is because Trump has been packing these courts. The GOP has been packing these courts with lackeys who preemptively exonerate the guilty and persecute the innocent. And so we need people to be stronger. We need them to be open about threats, for example, that judges and juries are facing. That's happening right now with Roger Stone. Basically, a culture of brutal honesty. And then on top of that, compassion and having a conscience and just trying to do right by other people, even at the most simple level, like even in just your day-to-day interactions with other human beings, like there's a sense of, okay, we've got the weight of the world on our shoulders. We have all these giant problems crushing us and hurting us and pushing us down. How do we ever solve it all? Like we can't as individuals, but collectively we can make a choice in our own lives about how we treat other people. And we can also work together and organize with other people and attack a lot of these systemic issues beyond what I mentioned. There are so many other things. There's economic inequality, climate change, and so forth. There are a lot of opportunities to try to make the world a better place. And I would encourage, you to look at it as a opportunity rather than like a doomsday sentence. We're on the precipice. We could go on a number of different directions. Like I said, I'm not optimistic, but there's sort of like no point in being either optimistic or pessimistic. It's like we're going to do what we can and then we're going to see where things play out. But in terms of the score being settled, I think we need total honesty, like total exposure, and then preventing these individuals or people like him, people with the same ambitions and evil goals from achieving power again. There needs to be a system to lock them out of that process so that they can no longer attack and prey upon the vulnerable.
Agreed. Jeff asks, if you had 30 minutes with Biden and his team, what would you recommend that they do right now?
Oh, God.
Basically everything you just said.
Pretty much. Today's April 22nd. Like I've been saying all along, Biden needs a coalition. He needs people, other Democrats behind him. He needs to announce his cabinet and who's going to be guiding his decisions. He does need to embrace a more progressive policy platform, especially in light of coronavirus and all of this economic devastation. And he also needs to focus on election security and making sure that we even have an election where we can vote for Joe Biden. And though I have some problems with Joe Biden, I absolutely encourage everyone to vote for him because you are voting against an existential apocalyptic threat. Biden is currently the alternative to that. Definitely feel free to criticize him and encourage him to, embrace a more progressive platform. But for those of you who aren't voting, that is such an irresponsible and cruel move right now. So unfortunately, vote for Biden.
And the next question is from Julia. She asks, so excited you're going to interview Sarah about her book today. Me too. My question for Sarah is, can you tell us more about how your childhood, parents, and the culture you grew up in influenced the course of your life, i.e. writing, living overseas, studying kleptocratic countries, anthropology, etc.? We know that being a badass is something you're born with, but besides that, love you both. Love you, Julia.
Okay, well, thank you, Julia. I don't know. I mean, I talk more probably in this book about my life and my autobiography than I ever do in any other format. It's generally not something I'm that comfortable doing. I was like a nerd with a problem with authority, and that hasn't really changed at all. I don't know. I'm somebody, I like to explore different things. I like to travel. I like to move around. I'm restless. My interests are a mix of highbrow and lowbrow, and I generally do what I want. And, in terms of following my own heart, my creative pursuits, my principles, whatever, I don't care about my reputation. If I have like advice to give to the world, that is my advice is just like, fuck all that. Fuck the careerism. Pursue your dreams. Hang out with people you actually like. That's why I do a show with Andrea instead of working for a media corporation. How I got this way, I mean, I think I was sort of always this way. I find like my diary from when I was 10 years old, and I'm like exactly the same. But I did have a good kind of support structure in terms of my grandparents, who also lived in my hometown, and they helped raise me just as much as my parents did. And I loved hanging out with them. I loved talking to them. And I think I benefited from having regular close contact with people who had lived through the Great Depression and had lived through and fought in World War II and had witnessed so many awful atrocities and managed to persevere. And I think that that instilled in me kind of a belief that yes, things could fall apart at any time, which is scary, but that you just keep going. You work through it, you suck it up, you take the hits, you keep living your life, and you look out for other people. Like that is what they left me with. So I'm always very grateful. I think I was extremely lucky to have 4 grandparents around.
So the next question comes from Sheridan. Sheridan asks, really appreciate the work you're doing and am a couple chapters into the new book, excited to finish it. My question is this: the current GOP is quite obviously complicit in this criminal presidency. Do you think they see what you see and know what you know and support the goal of transitioning of America away from democracy? Or do they live in ignorance like most of America? What percentage of the GOP do you believe fully understands what's going on and supports Trump anyway?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think the answer to that question has changed over the last 3 years. I think initially there was always an inner center to the GOP that was completely aware of this operation that Trump and his criminal cabal were engaged in. Paul Manafort was a GOP operative. Roger Stone was a GOP operative. And the entire time that they were GOP operatives, they were also criminals. They were the heirs of Nixon and Nixon criminal politics. But then you have to look at, the GOP in general. We had a massive wave of resignations during Trump's first year in office. There was a record number of, members of the GOP stepping down, even if they were pretty young, like in their 40s or 50s. And I think that's because they realized that in terms of their own careerism, opportunism, what have you, there was no choice but to join what was essentially an apocalyptic cult by that point. There was no choice but to surrender their individual aspirations to the Trump dream, which is just a kleptocratic dream for Trump and his family. And I think some of them just didn't want to be involved in that. That doesn't mean that they're necessarily good people or that they're going to go join the Democrats or what have you, but they don't approve. And I think Justin Amash is another example of someone who quite publicly doesn't approve. I think that there has been a move away from democracy and embracing democracy from the GOP for a long time. They'll talk about economic freedom. That was their whole calling card during the Reagan era. But what they really did was strip away our personal freedom by making us trapped in a system of debt, of lost opportunity, of lost wages, of not being able to survive. And when you're in that kind of conditions, you're not actually free. And I think that their idea of democracy became entwined in that it became a culture of fear. And I think some folks were drawn to the GOP because they seem to have this strongman politics aspect that could be maybe comforting when you're constantly living in fear from terrorism, from economic collapse, and so forth. In terms of what's happened now, though, now we've had basically a mafia state, or not basically, we've had a mafia state in power since 2017. And the GOP did stuff like put Michael Cohen in charge of their finances. Like he was the deputy finance chairman for the Republican Party. They had Russian mafia people putting in money through proxies like the NRA. And so what that means is that probably every Republican has dirty, dark money in their campaigns. They've accepted it. It's likely foreign money. They're basically trapped in this net. And yes, I do think that they understand this. I think they understand that this is culture built on blackmail and threats and bribes. And they've decided to just accept their lot in it and carry on. It's become a cult. And these are cult members. And that's why they're so intractable. That's why they wouldn't vote to convict them, even though they themselves would be freed from this. They're too afraid. And that's a severe problem. That's an unprecedented crisis for American history.
So the next question is from Diane. Diane asks, I'm still in progress listening to the audiobook. I did a surreal thing, which was to go on a solo backpacking trip with the audiobook. So there I am simultaneously marveling at the explosion of life that is springtime out in nature while listening to an apocalyptic accounting of the death and destruction of our country. Anyway, I wanted to tell you that when I saw your link to Politics and Prose and saw that you could support local bookstores buying from their Libro.fm page, I wondered if I could do the same, but for my own local bookstore, Chaucer's Books. So on my laptop, I did a Google search. I'm reading it all, folks. If you send it to me, I'll read it. So on my laptop, I did a Google search for Chaucer's and found a link to their website, but Hiding in Plain Sight was not listed. So I went back to Libro.fm and searched for Chaucer's through their bookstore search. That caused Libro.fm to change my bookstore, and then I could search for Hiding in Plain Sight and buy it through my local bookstore. Success. It was convoluted, but I managed to figure it out and support my city's last standing real independent bookstore. And that's why I read that part, because that's an important lesson to us all, to support independent books, and even if you need to take an extra step to do it. A question for you. Do you think progressives should do outrageous things so that our protests get covered like these fake Davos-funded protests? I'm thinking stuff like a kinetic sculpture parade, kind of a protest die-ins, things that are colorful and surprising enough, but not violent or horrifying, just to get on the news. Maybe we need a new Arlington West or an AIDS quilt project.
Yeah, well, first, thank you so much for buying the book and the struggle you went through to get it. I don't know exactly about outrageous things, but I think protests should be strategic. And a lot of aspect of good strategic protest is spectacle, is a play to emotion, is an honest presentation of the facts. I think there is a lot to admire in AIDS activism and in the gay rights movement. When I was a child, these were like taboo topics. They did not have mainstream support. That's one of the few really positive social trends over the last 30 years. Almost everything else seems to be moving backwards. But in terms of gay rights and certainly of acceptance of people who have HIV or have AIDS, we've moved forward. So there's a lot to learn from that history. One thing that's frustrating is you can't make the media cover a protest in the way you want. I was a firsthand witness to Ferguson. I was covering those protests myself in St. Louis, and I was also watching the national cable news coverage of those protests. And I knew that the news networks were only on one block of one street, yet they would have this background of like riots and fire, and they would portray it as if it was the entire city. And they would find basically people that fit their preconceived narrative of what a Black community in St. Louis was like, whether it's trying to portray them as violent, which is what Fox did, or interviewing people who didn't even live here and making them the unofficial or sometimes official representatives of a movement to which they weren't really attached. And so a lot of this is out of our hands. That's why I like social media, because I think it puts some of the power back in our hands. It allows for a correction of that narrative. And so I always encourage people to kind of find their own way. And, if you hate the mainstream media coverage and you have the means, then, cover it yourself, tweet about it, write your own essays, post your own photos, try to get the truth out there, organize your own protests, and also realize there is life beyond the mainstream news bubble. It may seem that everyone is believing what they see on TV, but they're clearly not, or they wouldn't all be online bitching about it. And that's honestly a pretty shared sentiment. You hear it from the right, you hear it from the left. Everybody is mad that the news is not reflecting their reality. So they're not really as powerful as they seem. And, when we spend a lot of time breaking down what they did wrong, that's a worthwhile pursuit. But an even more worthwhile pursuit is to build up those who are doing things right, whether independent media outlets or individuals who are protesting or individuals who are documenting the protest. That sometimes is a more effective means of getting your point across.
So the next question comes from Ingrid. Ingrid asks, I'm your long-term fan from Glasgow, Scotland. And we're long-term fans of Glasgow, Scotland, Ingrid.
True.
Could you ask Sarah to what degree she shields her kids from the realities of our global shit shows? My son is 18 and pretty savvy aware, but I often ponder how I would be handling things if he was younger. What parental line do you tread? Love to you both. Thanks for all your work. I'm proud to support your Patreon. Thank you, Ingrid.
Well, thanks, Ingrid. That's a difficult question. I have two kids. I have a 9-year-old and a 12-year-old, so third and seventh grade. So they're older. They read a lot. They read a lot of history. They certainly know quite a lot about this administration. And, they're aware of what I do. And they're also aware, unfortunately, of the threats to my personal safety that I've received, because there have been times we've had to, quickly leave our house or so forth. I try to shield them as much as possible from that threat. I don't want them to think about, my own life being in jeopardy, about me maybe not being around in the future. I just don't go down that road. I just tell them I'm going to be, and they're not allowed to listen to this show either. They're totally banned from listening to Gaslit Nation. But I do try to give them a broader education. Back when we did have freedom of movement and museums and stuff open, I was always taking them, as I write in the book, to presidential libraries, to museums, showing them the historical roots of the current crisis, so that they know that Trump didn't appear out of nowhere, that there's a history of racist demagoguery, that there is a history of systems collapsing. And they're very aware of this. I also write in the book about, a period of my own life, when I had two young kids and my husband was out of a job for over a year. They've lived through this, and we live in a rough city, so to speak. We live in a city that's been on hard times for a long time. They're observant kids. They pick up quite a lot. So it's not like I'm in some sort of suburban bubble or, wonderful world where they just don't know what's out there. They know it because they've experienced it. Their classmates experienced it. I experienced it. I am much more upbeat with them than I am on this show, or I am in public life on Twitter. I want them to have a real childhood. I want them to have friends and interests and a good time, and be happy and embrace, the joys that they find in life. So yeah, I do hide, some of my more pessimistic prognostications. I certainly hide the stuff I cover that has to do with Epstein or really disturbing shit. Like, it's just not appropriate for children at all. But I don't hide the general situation. I don't think that there's any point in that. So, my kids, they still believe in Santa, but they also know about the existence of the Russian mafia. So yeah, that's what it's like to grow up in my house. And I would also just say, like, having my kids and, having my husband is just a tremendous gift and a benefit. And, I love hanging out with my family. We're a very close-knit family. And back when we could move around, we loved to go on road trips, and we would go hiking and we'd go out and do stuff. And it was easier to stay sane, quote unquote, before we were self-isolating from a global pandemic. So hopefully we'll get back to that soon.
Now is the Tim asks, how do you keep from anger, rage, and despair taking hold of your everyday thoughts and life as we see what's unfolding?
Oh, I don't. Like, I'm totally full of rage. Like, I'm full of rage pretty much all the time. And honestly, I don't know another way to be given what's going on. And I mean, maybe I channel that rage in a good direction. Hopefully I do. I know I feel a sense of like visceral relief after I've written something or after, we've recorded one of these shows. I mean, it sometimes feels like all the energy is drained out of my body, like Eleven on Stranger Things at the end when she was battling people. Like, my daughter was like, that's like you, Mommy, after you write, because I'm just so tired. It takes so much out of me. Like, I put everything on the page. But yeah, I think it's perfectly normal to be extremely angry right now at what's happening. I honestly find it baffling that our officials are not acting with that level of anger. And maybe they think it's a matter of propriety or respectability, but I think it's wounding to the public, because what it comes off as is a lack of empathy or a lack of recognition as to what people are experiencing. Despair is something different. That's more of like a private emotion. And of course, we all have moments of despair. I do too. And I try to just keep going. But the rage can be healthy. The rage can be like fuel for your principles and your stances and your willingness to confront things. So yeah, I would just encourage people to embrace their rage.
So Sophie asks, thank you so much for the excellent, inspiring, and courageous work that you do. My question for Sarah Kendzior, if you have time for it. What advice would you give to folk, especially women and people of color, who are attacked and gaslit repeatedly in their work? How to find survival strategies?
Oh, that's a good question. And, Andrea and I experience this all the time, and women of color experience it more than we do. You can witness that on Twitter every day. I think what a lot of us have done is just try to back each other up, to find a community, to find partners. When you see somebody being attacked, reach out to them in support. I encourage people, share other people's work. There's this kind of like insular culture. I mean, you see it more on social media, where it's just like a bunch of like white guys retweeting other white guys who are retweeting things that are either lies or distortions, or just things that are playing down the extent of pain that's being experienced. And so I just encourage people to build up others. Like, don't value people by their title or the prestige attached to them. Value people by what kind of person are they? Like, what are they saying? Like, what kind of positions or moral stances do they hold? Like, what kind of art are they creating? Like, that's what makes people interesting. And I think we live in a fucked up society where other things like wealth and title and so forth are valued more. And I've always tried to basically destroy that system, in part because I think it's immoral. I think it's unsustainable, but it also prevents a lot of voices from being heard. And, in a result of living in this system, if you are a woman, and you are a creative or intelligent person, is that you're going to be continually marginalized, pushed aside, put down, etc. You got to just like try as much as you can to just not give a shit about any of that. Constructive criticism is one thing, but mindless attacks or mob attacks are something just, I don't know. I don't find it worth my time. I'd rather find my community, find a support system, and then just proceed from there.
Broody asks, here's my question. How does it feel to be always right? How do you not lose hope after yelling into the void for the last 5 years? Hope your quarantine is going okay. Be safe.
I mean, I don't know if I'm always right, but I'm right pretty frequently. So does Andrea. And, we both think it sucks. Like, we want very badly to be wrong. And the reason that we're right so often is that we are dealing with people who are following the textbook moves of an autocracy, and who are often announcing their ambitions in advance. Like, just this last week, everyone's so shocked about Trump and his stance on immigration. Like, that's what he ran on. That's what Stephen Miller said he was going to do. And then they actually do it. And everybody is surprised. I think what they're really surprised at is the lack of accountability and the lack of pushback from other officials. They're surprised that rules and norms and laws even are so malleable, that there isn't this real system, that it's all kind of invented. And so I don't know. In the book, as to the part of the question about hope, I say outright, I don't think about hope or hopelessness. I don't see the world in those terms. I see it in terms of principle and in trying to do what's right. And what alternative is there to that? Just like throwing your hands in the air? Like, I have kids, I have other people I care about. I care about the next generation and making sure that they don't inherit the system that I'm currently living in and that I grew up in. I wouldn't wish that on anybody. So of course I'm going to work to change things. But, I take the like Han Solo perspective of never tell me the odds, because it's just not worth it. It's not worth obsessing about that aspect.
So the next question comes from Saber Cat. Saber Cat asks, I love the names, by the way. So Saber Cat wants to know, can you see any nonviolent path toward unseating the Trump administration and its corporate backers?
That's a good question. I don't know. I do think we're headed towards violence, especially in between the period of the election, assuming it's held in November, and inauguration of whoever wins in January, whether it's Trump or Biden. I think that if Biden wins, if it's, even very obvious that he won, if there's a sweep, I think Trump will refuse to accept the results. And he's going to, seek to stay there. He's going to declare the election illegitimate. I think he's going to encourage violence and terrorism from his supporters. He's already doing that. I think if he wins, he will do the same thing, only it'll be portrayed as a kind of like victory party. So, I do think we're headed for violence. In terms of removing him, one of the reasons I've been so pissed off over the last 3 years is that we had many opportunities to remove him. Although the we here is pretty exclusive. It's really officials who hold the legal or political power to do that, like Robert Mueller or Nancy Pelosi. These are people who failed us. James Comey is another. They made the wrong choices. They did not act in time. They allowed a criminal empire to grow and entrench itself and purge agencies and pack courts and make everything harder to fix. And so now we are at this point, which many countries arrive in when they have a corrupt autocracy that really the majority dislike, in power of, is there going to be violence? I don't know, because I think that kind of mass protest, as I describe in the book, it's lost its leverage in the US to some extent because the GOP doesn't care about winning elections. They don't care about being popular. They care about stealing elections, which is a completely different thing. I think protest is still a worthwhile pursuit, but I do worry about it becoming violent because, again, they don't care. I mean, I studied in Uzbekistan a massacre where the state just gunned down like hundreds of people in plain sight, kind of similar to Tiananmen Square massacre in China, which notably Trump praised. I think that they would take that same approach. I could see them mass murdering protesters, which is one of the reasons I've been kind of hesitant sometimes to advise a course of action there, because they don't care who sees it. Like, they're autocrats, they're mafiosos, they're ruthless. They still need to be removed, though. I would just say try it from every avenue possible, from elections to lawsuits to whatever you can think of. But above all, be an honest broker, tell the truth in terms of trying to get people to your side. Don't try to deceive them or lie to them. Just lay out the story and lay out what's at stake for everybody. This is an existential crisis. So there's the possibility of us all getting on the same page. And if that happens, then, we're much more powerful as a collective than as individuals.
John asks, "Hi, I listen to Gaslit Nation weekly and share the same frustrations with our current nightmare situation that at this point all stems from an obvious top-down, non-leadership situation. My question is, can you envision a future where in the United States, actual crime as we witness daily is eventually served notice and punished? Going back decades as you have outlined and recognizing that as a whole, the U.S. hasn't been very strong in enforcing punishment for white-collar crime and mobsters in general, it is difficult to see a situation where as a country, we recognize criminal behavior and just flat-out punish it with teeth. In the hopes of averting future situations, whether it be in political campaigns or otherwise, I agree we can't hope for a savior, but at the same time, feel we should expect those in power to do their jobs. It shouldn't be too much of an ask."
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I always say to keep our expectations high, even if they won't be met or are unlikely to be met. These are public servants. They are working for us. We are paying their salaries. So no, this sort of sycophantic attitude that a lot of people have developed towards the politicians or officials, quote unquote, on our side, by which I mean, Mueller, Comey, Pelosi, the Epstein White court system, whoever it is that they think is going to bring this whole operation down. There's this whole vibe of like, ooh, don't criticize them, don't point out their flaws. Even when those are the people that are letting us down, those are the people who are making entrenched criminality possible. So I think, you should criticize them. You have every right to, make it as constructive as you can. I am worried at this point that so much time has passed, as I said before, that the Trump administration has managed to redo the court system. They've packed it with their lackeys and their apparatchiks. They've purged experts from our political system, whether experts on the Russian mafia in the FBI or people like Vindman and Yovanovitch and Fiona Hill and all the others who testified in impeachment, who were very knowledgeable about kleptocracy, both in the US and in the former Soviet Union. So I do worry that we will not have much of a takedown of this. And, now we have coronavirus, which of course is increasing the entrenched economic inequality and opportunity hoarding and favoritism towards corporations over people that we had before. I don't know, though. I mean, we are at a breaking point. It's possible we may be in for I think we are in for a very tumultuous year. And you never really know what's going to be the result of that. But it is frustrating that Congress won't do their jobs. I think even just having kind of a to-do list publicly, they once had this. They had like a list of like 81 people they wanted to have under oath to testify before Congress about all of Trump and his cohorts' white-collar crime activity and its role in the 2016 election. They abandoned that entirely. If they just go back to that, to hearings, to all these things, which they can do virtually. I mean, if we're able to have this show virtually and everyone else is teaching virtually, working virtually, Congress can operate virtually too and have hearings virtually. They need to do that because it's just important for people to know the truth. And it's important to try to pursue justice, even if you don't think it's going to be delivered.
So the next series of questions come from Sky Dweller. Forgive if these questions have been covered on the show already, but I'm curious as to what led Sarah into anthropology. Did she seek the scholarship? Was it a field she was already aware of? Was there an event that inspired her to go in that direction? What did she originally plan to be when she grew up?
Okay. Well, some of that's answered in Hiding in Plain Sight. No, I never set out to be an anthropologist or an academic. I don't even think I knew that those types of jobs existed as a kid. I wanted to be a writer. That's what I've always been in some capacity, whether in academia or in journalism or for a time writing fiction. And, I lay out in the book how my career path went. And like a lot of people my age, it was, who don't have any money, it was untraditional. It had a lot to do with, what kind of fellowships I was offered, what kind of opportunities presented themselves at the time.
So follow-up questions from Sky Dweller. What contributed to her ability to distill the complex such that it's digestible by a mass audience? Guns N' Roses, probably.
Obviously.
Having an English teacher and an engaged mom surely helped, but did Sarah have a leap in learning to think critically, and how did that happen? I.e., is it replicable? Does she have other unusual intelligence in addition to
synesthesia? This is someone... Okay, so I have synesthesia, which is just a thing where in your head, when you see letters or numbers, they are in color, they have sounds associated with them. When I see musical notes or chords, they are also in colors. Like I've sometimes discussed this on Twitter. It's like impossible to explain this to somebody who doesn't have it. And as a kid growing up, I really thought everyone had synesthesia. Like, of course, everybody knows that A is red, or, like what color chord C is, or things like that. I don't know. I mean, I was like a musical kid. I taught myself how to play piano. I was very artsy. I wrote a lot. And I have no idea. Like, I think that, that probably contributed to the way I write, to it being a kind of unconventional style of writing or thinking, but I don't know. I mean, like everybody's a product of multiple influences, and God knows I was all over the place in terms of who I hung out with and my interests, and Guns N' Roses really were an influence. Like Andrea was being sarcastic, but it's totally true. I learned a lot from my like musical collection and whatnot, but also from more like highbrow shit. So it's a real mix.
And so just to expand on these questions from Sky Dweller, he says, here's one motive for my questions. How can we help others, especially kids, learn to think more critically and analytically? How can we learn to suspend belief, disbelief, and examine information with fresh eyes?
Those are great questions. And of course, now we have kids home from school. So this is something I think about a lot. And I'm always encouraging them to just read widely, like just explore everything. If you have an interest and it's esoteric and weird, like just follow it. And I don't know, like sometimes people, I think the younger generation is abandoning this proclivity, and I think it's good. But when I was growing up, people are often so obsessed with like, what do my tastes indicate about me? What do my interests indicate about me? Like, your CD collection or your book collection was considered this giant statement on your internal world. And I would watch people sort of cover their actual tastes and interests because they were like embarrassed or something like that. I was never like that. Like I always kind of just let it all hang out. And I always kind of I wanted to travel everywhere. I wanted to see everything. I wanted to read everything. And that's just how I was wired. But, when my kids show that same tendency, I encourage them to explore everything, except for, as I mentioned, this podcast and my associated R-rated works. But, one thing that's happened to our country is I do think there's sort of a deficit of imagination, because if you're imaginative, if you're not conforming, you're really discouraged from having a prominent voice in our culture. We have technically a free media, but they act in such monotony. And I think the presence of algorithms in which stories are just literally repeated over and over and over in a literally robotic way, it's led to people thinking in a robotic way. Like, we've had such a sea change in terms of how we process information because of the internet. And I also think we've had such an immense amount of propaganda and bullshit and conspiracy theories that people have become very hyper vigilant, but in a negative way, about opening their mind to the possibility that things are not what they seem. They don't want to seem alarmist. They don't want to seem hyperbolic. They don't want to seem hysterical. That tendency has, in fact, doomed us in many respects over the last 4 to 5 years in particular, but just general in terms of learning the truth about things. Because the truth is often much more alarming and much more complex than it's presented. And people are so worried about their reputations and about seeming a certain way or not advancing in their career that they're ignoring really important things, whether it's systemic racism or income inequality or the presence of a transnational crime syndicate masquerading as a government. So I definitely encourage people, remain open-minded, but be vigilant in your sourcing, double check information. Don't accept anything at face value, but also don't dismiss anything at face value.
So Sky Dweller is not done yet. What have other societies done to overcome tyranny, and what new thinking actions do we need to apply in the face of mainstream and social media organizations that support authoritarianism?
Oh God, that's a huge question. And since we're kind of running low on time, I would just encourage you to go back to our archives. We have them on gaslitnationpod.com. We have a reading list. We have many episodes where, we detail how other countries have done this. Andrea has spoken quite a lot about Ukraine and their revolutions. And this is the kind of question that, I am trained as an anthropologist. You need to look at each place in its own political and historic context.
Yeah, check out the Gaslit Nation action guide and the reading guide on gaslitnationpod.com. So Natalie asked pretty much the same question. Everything feels very hopeless right now. What actions should we be taking? What can we do when we feel helpless? Where do we look for hope? How do we get out of this autocracy situation?
Yeah, that's the question we've been reckoning with for years, and certainly one that we wrestle with every time we do this show. And it's normal to feel that feeling of hopelessness, to feel some sense of despair or panic. Like, there's so much shaming of that emotion. I see that all the time on social media. Like, how dare you express any kind of negative feeling? It's normal. We're living through a pandemic. We're living through, a proto-fascist regime. We're living through a mafia syndicate. It's tough, and so what I do during those times is, I reach out to people who I love and who I trust for support. I also don't feel bad if I'm binge watching Netflix or reading a book for fun or, what have you. I used to go out for hikes and stuff before the self-isolation rule, just to try to free my mind a little bit and not be so overwhelmed by this. And, I answered earlier in the show about pragmatic suggestions, but, I definitely encouraged a sense of perseverance. This isn't going to be solved easily. It's not going to be solved all at once, but just keep going and know that you're part of a broader struggle. There are millions and millions of people, tens of millions who feel the same way and are working to the same goal. And I think it's harder now with the pandemic because we don't see each other face to face as much. And we don't even see each other really represented in the news because they're too busy with the AstroTurf protests or the propaganda rallies. But everybody's out there and you're not alone in this. So, that's something important to remember.
Zacharias asks, if Sarah were to want a position in the Biden administration, what job would she want and why?
Oh, good God, no. I don't want to be part of any administration. I don't want to run for Congress. I don't want to do any of that, at least not now. If you forced me to pick a position, I would say Secretary of State. We'll just go with that. I'm a writer, first and foremost. I have a tendency to criticize power, which means I'm not probably ideally suited to work within the halls of power. So yeah, I think I'm good where I am.
Jeanette says, I'm listening to Sarah read her book. It is amazing. I just wanted to thank her for writing it and being so candid. That's wonderful, Jeanette. Okay, so Jefferson's Notes asks, Sarah, you are the voice of St. Louis and flyover country, but you're originally from Connecticut. I can tell. Winky face. What did you learn there and take with you to Central Asia and beyond?
Yeah, I grew up in central Connecticut and took it with me to Central Asia and then the center of the US. I grew up in Meriden, Connecticut. I describe this somewhat in the book. Like Meriden is another blue collar post-industrial town that by the time I was born, its glory days were long behind it. My parents grew up there. My grandparents grew up there. Like hardly anyone in my family has left Meriden. So, I'm actually was kind of moving up in the world when I went to St. Louis, which at least is, in its own way, kind of a major city. And it's got, museums and cafes and, what have you. I don't know. Like, I haven't really gone back to Connecticut since the 90s. I would go back to visit my grandparents when I could, and then when they died, I just don't go back as much. My parents, come to visit me. In terms of my childhood, I was a very typical early millennial, late Gen X kind of childhood, like latchkey kid, a lot of freedom. They said that we're the best prepared generation for the pandemic because we were used to just hanging around the house and having to entertain ourselves and having to be self-sufficient. And that's true. That was true of my life. But I don't know. It's like one of these things where I'm much more attached to where I'm bringing up my own kids, where I live now, and I've lived for 16 years, and where I'm a mother than my own childhood. Because on the times that I have gone back, it's like everyone I know is left. Like there was no opportunities for us there. And so, my old neighbors and friends, they live all over the country. So it's not like this sort of nice thing where you go back to your hometown and everyone's there. Like my grandparents are gone, the stores that I knew, the mall, it's all kind of wiped out with the economy. And I like to visit my parents. That's kind of it. So yeah, St. Louis is where it's at.
So we have a few more questions, which we're going to save for our next show, which will be back to taping weekly starting next week after this brief break, just to recuperate from a hectic news cycle. And then we're back at it again, and we'll wrap up the final questions. And if you want to continue on with the Q&As, we do them every month for our Patreon supporters who keep our show going and give us the freedom to say what needs to be said. Thank you to everyone who listens to the show, who supports the show, who gets the word out. And please check out Sarah's book, Hiding in Plain Sight. Get a copy for yourself. Get copies for everybody that needs to know what's happening and where we're headed if we don't stop it. And if you need hope or other ideas for reading material, go to the Gaslit Nation website on gaslitnationpod.com and check out our action guide and also our reading guide. And thank you all for listening. Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher.
We want to encourage you to donate to your local food bank, which is experiencing a spike in demand. We also encourage you to donate to Direct Relief at directrelief.org, which is supplying much needed protective gear to first responders working on the front lines in the US, China, and other hard-hit parts of the world.
We encourage you to donate to the International Rescue Committee, a humanitarian relief organization helping refugees from Syria. Donate at rescue.org. And if you want to help critically endangered orangutans already under pressure from the palm oil industry, donate to the Orangutan Project at theorangutanproject.org. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kendzior and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon, it keeps us going.
Our production managers are Nicholas Torres and Carlin Daigle. Our episodes are edited by Nicholas Torres, and our Patreon exclusive content is edited by Carlin Daigle.
Original music in Gaslit Nation is produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damian Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Adam Levine,
Alabama,
Alan Liu,
and Marshall,
Brian Tahuden,
Carol Goldstad,
Catherine Anderson Corena,
David Porter,
Diana Gallagher,
D.L. Singfield,
Dorothy Kamerick,
Doug Friedenberg,
Elizabeth Dove,
Emmy,
Eric Kaplan,
Arena Guardia,
Ethan Mann,
Evan Rosemore,
Fontaine Carpenter,
George Hughes,
Gustav Halsby,
Janet Robinson,
Jared Lombardo,
Jason Benke,
Jason Rita,
Jeff Thompson,
Jennifer Slavic,
Jens Alstrup Rasmussen,
Jons Alstrup Rasmussen. The name's so
Okay,
nice
fine.
you say it twice. Joel Newman,
John Astrick,
John Laughlin,
John Ripley,
Karen Humphreys,
Kate Cotton,
Katie McHugh,
Katie Musiris,
Keith Gottschalk,
Kelly Ranson,
Kevin Gannon,
Kevin M. Garnett,
Christy Vital,
Lawrence Graham,
Leo Chalupa, so sing-songy,
Lindsay Eggleston,
Lisa LaFlame,
Lorraine W. Todd,
Luke Stranded,
Lynn Schneider,
Mandy Farrapore,
Marcus J. Trent,
Margaret Moe,
Mary Wong,
Matt Perez,
Maureen Murphy,
Michael Stinoff,
Michael Woodridge,
Michelle Dash,
Mike Tripico,
Nicole Spear,
Oliver Ash,
Pamela Newport,
Ray Alba,
Rhonda White,
Rich Craw,
Richard Smith,
Sandra Kalnins,
Sonia Bogdanovic,
Sharon Hattrick,
Solomon Hikes,
Tanya Chalupa,
Tracy,
Victoria Nordgren,
Victoria Olson,
William Barry Reeves,
Ren.
Zachary Lemon.
Thank you all so much for your support. We could not make the show without you.